Ellen, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Jenna.
Excited to talk to you. So I want to just jump right in, and I think I want to start things off by talking about sort of your tenure at DuPont and some of the challenges and the things that you learned about taking a legacy company that is all of a sudden finding itself in competition with much younger, much more nimble startups, both in terms of talent acquisition and just general strategy, and kind of what are some of the things you took away from that?
You know, I think that's one of the hardest things about older companies is that their current success gets in the way of their future success. You know, we're a company that's, 214 years old. We've changed a lot. First 100 years was explosive. Second 100 years, modern chemistry. The last, 20 years has been around integrating sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, and the like. And it is about making sure that you're not wedded to the wrong thing. So whether it's young, nimble startups in the United States or Chinese competition or, or Brazilian competition, it's making sure you get your businesses focused on what winning looks like. So the business model has to be dynamic. You've got to make sure that they're not, cutting into you because they're coming at the marketplace differently than you are. So are you continuing to innovate? We had to reset the organization. We had found that in the decade before, we had morphed to a place where we weren't as responsive to the market. And we were seeing a lot of competition coming in, specifically from China, right before the global financial crisis happened. And we had to reset our organization. We took out layers of leadership. We aligned it around the businesses that we wanted. We set a vision for the company of this is where we're going. And the vision had to have purpose and relevance to the young workers today. We were hiring at an unprecedented rate right before the global financial crisis and then coming out of it. And so it really was making sure that people knew that change was a constant, and you had to make the environment safe for them to change.
And on that note, you mentioned something backstage that I found to be really fascinating, that when you were trying to invigorate a 200-year-old company, the changes sort of can lead people to think that what was being done before was wrong. And you kind of have to honor that history, and I was hoping you could elaborate on that a little bit more because I thought that was...
It was interesting because I'd been with the company, 27 years, and I came mid-career. I'd worked 10 years for two different other Fortune 100 companies, and 5 years each. And so when I got there, I was watching how people coming in mid-career integrated into a company that had a very strong culture. And there were people who did very well, and there were people who flamed out. And the difference was the ones that could understand the culture and honor the good in it, yet show people a different direction to build on it, were really successful. The people that came in and said, you guys are just, that was wrong, the organization could freeze them out very, very quickly. So what I got good at in every different business and different opportunity I had in the company is how do you honor what's good about an organization? How do you build on that and tell the story, the storytelling of what's good, and how where you're going is going to be even better than where you've been. And so you honor the good, and then you tell them what needs to change in order to continue to be successful.
And on that note, do you think that is it sort of trying to behave internally like a startup, or sort of take too many notes from a young and super nimble model of a company? Is that overrated? I guess the thing that's interesting about a company like DuPont is that it's sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of companies that are, have that kind of sizable legacy. There's Procter & Gamble. There's lots of companies that are sort of facing that challenge.
Well, I think the word nimbleness is an interesting one because the world's a competitive place, and it's getting more competitive, not less competitive. And so what that means is that you have to be really clear about what you're doing, where you're going, and how you're going to go about getting there, and getting your teams, engaged, and giving them the runway to go get it done, and holding them accountable. Hold the mirror up. Are they getting there or not? And using the external measures. How you doing versus that competitor? What's working, what's not? But giving them the autonomy to figure out what they should change. There were very few things. I learned from my predecessor that you want to, in a big company, you want to keep the number of things that are mandated across the entire company to an absolute minimum. For us, it was our core values: safety, environmental stewardship, respect for people, highest ethical standard. But if you want to try a different business model, go ahead. if buy, make, deliver, we don't have to own the assets, you want to license instead of, there's a lot of different ways you can go at creating value. And you have to give people the freedom to do that. Otherwise, you're going to be the dinosaur, right? And you're going to be gone. And I think one of the reasons that DuPont's been around for 214 years is because it continually changed. It was just maybe rapid evolution that occurred over time. And it's continuing today.
You said something to a moment ago that I wanted to return to, which was this idea of energizing a workforce and energizing a workforce that is embedded within a much, a storied company and that might be slightly older. And how do you do that in a way that still feels authentic and not too overzealous or alienating?
It's, so first, I think that, when I was listening to Amy Cuddy this morning talking about presence, I think that's absolutely required. Leadership has to be present, which means you have to be kind of front and center and talking about it and engaging and listening probably more than you're talking and getting the feedback from it. I spent a lot of time, in big town hall meetings, but I used to, every place I went, I used to do 1 or 2 small group meetings, 10 to 12 people, cross-section of the organization. Sometimes we'd take a supply chain group and they'd range from 20 to 60. Other times we'd take just one segment, group of engineers. And I'd just sit down, I'd give my 5-minute start, and then for an hour and a half, I'd just listen to them and answer their questions. And you learn more about where their concerns are, what they're excited about, how they see the future evolving. And that really helped me understand how I could help focus the company in getting done the important things we had to get done.
And something I'm continuously fascinated by is, and we emailed about this a bit for the piece I worked on in the magazine, and sort of this idea of how do you attract younger talent, and how do you sort of think about what younger workers are interested in, and are their values different? And it felt like you'd had a lot of experience kind of interfacing. So you're kind of dealing with, more, just like 2 totally different generations of a workforce.
Well, I have 3 millennials.
And you also have 3 millennials. Yeah.
And so, when they told me there's no way they go to work for the DuPont company, I wanted to know why. And yet they, one works for GE and the other 2 are going to work for industrial companies as well when they graduate from college this spring. And the reason was because they didn't want to work for their mother.
Right.
But that's kind of. But it's interesting. When we came out of the global finance, I started my job in September of 2008. Okay, and then Lehman weekend happened, and the plans kind of went in the drawer and stuff. And as we were coming out, we actually were hiring at a rate that we hadn't hired since the 1980s. Wow. And so I was the chief recruiting officer because we hadn't been present in some of these universities in quite some time. So I'd go out and give speeches, I'd meet with students, and and it was interesting. What they wanted to know that what they were doing was making a difference, and they became interested in DuPont because at that point we were kind of focusing the company down into 3 areas: feeding a growing population, so agriculture, food ingredients, defining a more sustainable energy future, solar, lightweighting vehicles for higher fuel economy, number of things, biofuels from waste, and then securing people in the environment. So think Kevlar, think things about protecting people and things like that. And so we were really focused on those 3 areas. And people got excited about that. Kids got excited about that. They wanted to go work in nutrition, and it's not about the quantity of food, it's about the nutritional content and things like that. And so we were able to bring in a lot of young people who were very excited about where the company was going.
That there was this sort of commonality and an interest in doing something with a bigger meaning beyond sort of just a day-to-day job.
They could contribute to making the world a better place. That was important to them. But so was flexible work hours. So it's, they kind of had to bring it all together. They want it all.
Yeah. Are there any other interesting trends too, or any advice, I guess, that you have for companies that are managing a workforce that does span two totally different generations and different types of expectations around the workplace and sort of what that means to them?
It was interesting because we threw them all in together. And we said we thought, okay, should we create a different organization because we were entering some new businesses, and should we just make them part of the mainstream DuPont? We decided to make them mainstream DuPont, and it was really interesting. One of the first small group meetings I had was supply chain, and it was a group of 12 people ranging in age from 22, like 3 weeks with the company, to 65. Wow. And it was interesting to hear I've been trained in supply chain at a university, and I have the modern tools. and I have the 40 years of experience. And to listen to them talk together and learning from each other has been, I think, a powerful part of it, because the tools are interesting, but if the supply chain is such that it's going to be more costly, or it's not going to solve the customer's problems, then you've got to marry the two. And we found that by putting them in natural work groups and having them learn from each other is a very powerful way to continue to improve and drive the culture.
I want to make sure we have time for questions, but before that, I want to ask you one more thing, which is one of the recurring themes that keeps bubbling up over the course of the day is this idea that there's a lot to be learned from just A, the culture of innovation, but B, also kind of letting young people kind of roam free, or kind of learning lessons from, like this morning, Rachel Pepper was saying that Lana Dunham's show Girls came through a 22-year-old who'd seen her movie. I mean, are there things that we can learn from, employees that are coming onto the workplace at the same age as someone, who's been at DuPont for 20 plus, 30 plus years,
Oh, so the interesting thing is that chemists believe that the world operates at a molecular level that only chemists can understand. And biologists believe the same in biology. And we were creating a lot of different materials by the integration of these sciences. And there was a generational difference. The chemists we had were mostly my generation, maybe 10 or 15 years younger. The biotech guys and biologists, men and women, were in their 30s and 20s, 30s, and 40s, and and they fight like cats and dogs because each one was coming at it from a purist standpoint. And I mean, literally one time, I told a group of them, I said, "You're staying in this conference room until you figure out this problem. It's a very specific problem. It would take both sciences to solve." And just, I don't care what time it is, don't go home, you're going to just stay here till it gets done. And they laughed, but they did. And one of the things, the interesting thing one of the guys said was, we each have a purpose, and we figured out how to use each one's skills to collaboratively solve that problem. And I can tell them to do it, I can threaten them, I can do things like that, but until you get a group of people sitting in the room saying, okay, and we got a serious problem, we got to solve it, how do we do it? And they did it. They became real advocates. And they, spread that story throughout the company. They'd go out and talk about how we still protect our IP, but we open our science up in ways that can help solve problems faster. And it took a cross-generational, because the problem was more complex than just, let's open it up. Young guys, let's just open it up. The old guys are saying, oh my God, somebody's going to steal our technology, the world's going to cave in, type of thing. And collectively, they figured out a way to do it that protects our technology and creates great science out with our customers at a rate faster than we ever could before. So I think you've got to pull the power of both, and you've got to rely on them and understanding that they're not threatening each other.
Right.
But building together, we can create a much better place going forward.
Right. And to build on that, I mean, are there any particular techniques that you think are effective for helping develop that intergenerational trust or that intergenerational collaboration, or something that sort of helps facilitate so there isn't a fear of one replacing the other or one not being as valid as the other?
I think, and we talk a lot about teams and how to get more out of teams, and it's an art, and a science type of thing. But I do think you need to have on your team people who truly believe that and aren't, so one of the things I had to do is I had to generationally change almost my entire staff over the course of the 7 years I led the company, because people were sometimes get so embedded in the way they were successful in growing up in the organization, and inhibited them from allowing new techniques and things to come in, just like the way they work together. And so I do think you have to size up your leadership. You've got to make sure you understand how they're leading, and how, and how they are creating an environment where it's safe for people to disagree. It's safe for people to have a different idea. And because that's the only way a company is going to continue to change, continue to evolve, and succeed.
Great. I'd love to open it up and see if there are any questions. Does anyone have anything at this moment they'd like to jump out? Yes, over here in the corner. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are and where you're from.
Hi there, Teresa Costantinides, University of California. And earlier on in your talk, you were talking about making environments safe for change to occur. Can you give me some examples of things you did in DuPont to make that a safe environment?
So one of it was actually that I was asked to lead back so many years ago that I was probably my mid-30s when I was asked to do it, late 30s, and that was to start a new business in DuPont around safety. And I picked 5 people. And so you have to understand that part of the safety in a large organization is being part of a large organization. So where you have to go off and start something new and small and not connected to anything, it's scary. So, I had a reputation, pretty good reputation for doing, following through on what I said. Whatever I said, I normally got done. So I told these guys, look, if this thing implodes in 6 months, I'll find y'all jobs within the company. You're safe. So, and we established a cadence around that they come in and they laugh about it. Am I still safe? After a month and it wasn't going well, and our first business model didn't work out well. It was the third business model that really started growing the business. And so you have to make it safe. I mean, literally at that point I was saying, your job is safe if you come with me and do this. But in other times, what it is, it's about making sure that people understand that if it's kind of, the organization's going to be worse if they don't speak up than if they do. And so, as a leader, the one thing I would do is I would never put my voice in the room first unless it was an absolute emergency and there was only one way to go and we had to go quickly. I would sit there and say, there are a lot of different ways we can go on this. Tell me your ideas. And, or I set it up on, one day, so next week we're going to meet on this. I want to see your 5 ideas for doing A, B, and C. And listening to them talk to each other about it, they could come up with a great answer, and I'm just sitting there saying, great, thanks, kind of thing, because you had to make it okay for them. If I said, gee, my idea is I think we should launch this product in this marketplace first and forget about these other 2 markets, they say, okay, done deal, we'll go do that. It might not be the right answer. And so you have to make it that their voice counts, and if they feel heard, whether their idea gets chosen or not, if they feel like you've heard you, they'll follow you anywhere. At least that's within the culture of DuPont.
Great. Is there another one, by any chance? Another question? Oh.
You started your career at GE, which is famous for its training, but that was the Six Sigma. Beth Comstock was talking about it yesterday. I was just curious if you think that very highly process-oriented training was the most effective training for you as a leader, or was it some other experience?
When I started at GE after I finished grad school, and they brought all the experienced MBAs into a corporate marketing program or corporate plans program. And my next rotation was I worked on the staff of one of the vice chairs, a guy by the name of Ed Hood. So I watched how decisions were made. I participated at like 29 years old. I participated in S1, S2, the personnel reviews, understood how they made decisions rounding in the billions on businesses, what they bought, what they sold, why they bought RCA, for instance. And it was an education for 1 year that you could not have gotten anywhere else. And I learned about, Jack Welch was the chair and CEO then. I learned about how he made decisions, how the corporation ran. And it was just eye-opening. And it was, so after 1 year, they told me, okay, you got to go back and start taking the bus and go earn your stripes. So you're going to go out and be a marketing manager. You're going to go out and I was out in medical. But, Six Sigma, process, you have to have something. But I think I learned more really understanding how a very high-functioning organization works and makes very complex decisions across, a conglomerate, basically. Was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences at a very young age. And it really set me on a course of saying, I want to run a business. I want to run I have modest things. I want to run a product line, a couple $100 million. It's going to be a lot of fun. And it was amazingly, it was like drinking from a fire hose for 12 months. Oh, right there.
One question, Peter Burkholz with Page and Turnbull. One question I've been wanting to ask a lot of people is, it seems like a limit on innovation is regulation. And I guess, what do you feel is appropriate for corporations, be it you or Google and driverless cars, to sort of influence regulation to sort of speed up innovation versus regulation, I guess, preserving the environment or whatever?
No, I think that I think anymore corporations, companies, anything has to work with government, with NGOs to make it come out in the right place. Because we always felt like for us to be a successful company, our shareholders had to succeed, our products, our customers had to be successful, the communities where we operated had to want us, and our employees had to be successful. So we had to get all four, whatever order you want in. The world's becoming increasingly regulated, and I think companies have to have a voice. I think it needs to be transparent. It needs to stem, in many cases, from an environment or standpoint from science. And I think countries, customers get to choose. I spent a lot of time working on patent reform because we're a company that relies on a tremendous amount of patents in the American Invents Act, and I worked in the Jobs and Competitiveness Council in the American Invents Act. Because if we're not willing to at least have a voice and give them our perspective, then will America be manufacturing anything in the future? Wow. How will we, what is the future of our workforce? And so I do think that we have to engage in an appropriate way and in that process. I mean, in China, I've been very active in China because the food industry in China is treated the same way as the pharmaceutical industry is. And if you ever try to change an ingredient in a food, we have a probiotics plant north of Beijing, ever try to change an ingredient in there, it was like changing an ingredient in a drug. And so, you have to be sitting there working with the powers that be in order to get the regulation, on more global standards that create a stronger world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more. If there's anyone that has one. Okay, yes, right there.
Yes, I'm Jody Miller, CEO of Business Talent Group. We've been hearing so much about unconscious bias against women. And I'm just curious, you obviously overcame, if it exists, I'm not a scientist. What did you do that we should all learn from?
Well, I was the youngest of four, and I was beat upon a lot by my older brothers and sisters during my life, so that probably made me a little tough-skinned. I do believe it exists. I do believe, and I have experienced it even in my role with other CEOs type of thing. I could tell you some funny stories, or maybe not so funny. But I do think that if you're not willing, now what I tell young people all the time, men, women, whoever, if you're not willing to speak up for yourself, no one else will. You have to do it in an appropriate way. Sometimes you got to pick your moment. But if if you feel strongly, you should find a way to speak up for yourself. Sometimes it didn't work out so well for me when I did. Sometimes it worked out great. But I will tell you that from every experience, I learned from it and I became stronger. And I was better able to navigate the environment because of it. And I do think that that's something that I think especially young women kind of stand back on a lot, is what I see, even in my own company. And I spent a lot of time talking to them about it and trying to make it safe for them. But I mean, I believe that, if we'd measure a lot of things, how many women are on a slate to pick somebody for a job, how many women did we promote last year at these level bands from managers and that, and from a total diversity standpoint, just not women, but total diversity standpoint. And, we weren't happy with where we were, so the only people that could change it was us. And so it's something that I think you have to continually focus on. I think my children believe that is done, that doesn't exist anymore. I'm not so sure. I think it's still there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. That's all the time we have. But that was wonderful, Ellen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.